Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'm going to talk about how astrology and talismans work. Basically, I want to give some alternative models to the ray and the battery model. Now, this video follows on from an earlier video on the deep structure of astrological magic, and I'm going to go over some of the same stuff, but it's very important, I think, to give this background. Otherwise, you're really not understanding what's going on. A lot of what we do is we jump ahead, we assume we know everything, we don't examine our unconscious assumptions or approach, and then we automatically just essentially put ourselves in a box in our thinking, and we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again and keep getting confused. So being aware of what we really think and being aware of our worldview is really key. So worldview, I almost always start with that. I start with that in my courses. Worldview is our conscious philosophy, but also our unconscious assumptions of reality. In fact, it is our reality. And the tendency with worldview is to assume, well, this is reality, it's objectively true, and anyone who thinks differently is just wrong or insane, basically, without recognizing that it's possible to have different worldviews. And so the current worldview, what's really holds sway, it's held sway for the past 300 years, is what I refer to as atheistic materialism. And this is the view that nothing exists except matter and energy, that matter and energy are the same, equals mc squared, and therefore then, if you talk about the spiritual, that just means psychological. It's a fancy term for psychological, and then the psychological, in fact, is just brain function, and the brain function, resolves down to electrochemical impulses. So it's all physical, it's all material and energetic, and everything is reducible to material and energetic causes ultimately, because that's all that really exists. So this view is basically what everybody knows, and everybody operates either consciously or unconsciously following that. What's confusing about this situation is that it's what I call the truce. And so about 17th century, atheistic materialism sort of took over the elite, the scientists, and the truce was basically that the atheistic materialists would determine the true nature of reality, and everyone would accept that ultimately, but that religious people would be allowed to be irrational, on Sundays. You could believe in God on Sundays, or you could believe in God as sort of a separate belief floating out by itself. But otherwise, everything was atheistic materialism. So your understanding of reality is very much focused on that. So this, in the modern era, it leads to sort of new age thinking, which again, they're doing magic or doing a spiritual path, but ultimately if you push people on it, how does it work? They're going to give you a materialistic or energetic explanation. So this process with, like I said, Protestantism, deism, those are all basically ways of getting rid of the magical and spiritual elements, but holding on to little pieces of it while still having a basically atheistic materialistic philosophy. And the contemporary methodology, like I said, is to be unconsciously atheistic, materialistic, or compartmentalized. Like I said, so you go to church on Sunday and, you do whatever you say, yeah, I believe in God, and then you go to work and, or do your daily stuff and you're an atheistic materialist. So the unconsciousness is a problem because we don't even realize that this is our worldview. So if we compare that, if we sort of move into astrology, the general view of astrology is like, well, how does it work? Is going to be basically beams, beams, rays, fields. People that are somewhat naive actually believe that there is a physical, it's actually magnetism or it's string theory or quantum mechanics. There is absolutely no scientific evidence whatsoever for the causality of astrology being material or energetic. It's just not. There's no evidence at all. The more sophisticated, we'll talk about spiritual quote energy. I mean, it behaves like energy, but it's spiritual, so it's not detectable. It's not going to show up on a X-ray or whatever. It's not going to. The beams aren't going to be detectable by a scientist, but they're analogous to that. And so there is a long tradition of this. The medieval Arabic astrologer Al-Kindi wrote a book called On the Stellar Rays. His view was that everything gives off these sort of straight line spiritual rays. So there's a lot of support for that, even in the tradition. But the attraction of it, again, if your view is atheistic materialism, it has to be that. I mean, it can't be anything but some kind of beams or rays because that's all there is. So the causality then with this view is that the planets are directly causing things, that they're beaming energy at you. It's either good or bad. What you can do is look at a chart, like a natal chart, for example, which is what most people are going to be thinking of with astrology is a natal chart. You can see what's afflicted, you can see what's benefic, and you know what the cause of things are directly because it's the planets, like I said, beaming energy, whether rays or fields or whatever. And you can solve the problem. If you have a problem in the chart, you just look at the chart. Saturn's afflicted. Okay, I need to block the Saturn rays, or I need to fix Saturn. I do something like that, and that'll solve the problem because that's the causality. So if you carry that into talismans, basically a talisman under this atheistic materialistic view is seen as being like a battery. So it's a physical object. It's charged with certain beams of radiation from the planets or whatever. It radiates the energy out of it. So then you want to carry it, because you want to have the energy coming to you. You don't want to get too far away from the rays. As I've said, I've seen things where people say you have to wear it next to your skin. You got to wear it 24 hours a day. And again, that's, I think, makes sense if you've got this idea of beams. Similarly, since it's just an inert physical object, the charge is going to run out like a battery. You can throw it away when you're done with it. It doesn't really matter. It's just, junk it. It's garbage and get rid of it. So these really are very popular explanations, beams and rays for astrology, talismans as batteries. They're popular because of atheistic materialism. I mean, obviously it has to be that way because that's all that could be. It has to be energy because all there really is energy. And so if that's an automatic and that seems logical, then it's because it fits with this atheistic materialism. Is a lot of it. Now, again, this is not to say that, our predecessors didn't have these views of it, but a lot of the punch, a lot of the pull for moderns in this understanding and this view of causality is because this fits with atheistic materialism. And so, even with these spiritual rays with Al-Kindi, we're talking about an external agent. That's the focus. I mean, we have a very Newtonian view of causality. I mean, for example, Newton's first law of motion is an object in motion tends to remain in motion along a straight line unless acted upon by an outside force. So the causality is sort of billiard balls. Things are bumping into each other. The beams are sort of a less physical means, but they're still that same, direct, external cause is, why things happen. So, even if we're going to stay with sort of a vaguely atheistic materialistic view, nevertheless, there are other types of causality other than external causality. You think about internal causality. So in this, a thing does what it's designed to do. Like think of a clock. I mean, a clock, the hands move around, and there's no external causality whatsoever. It's self-regulated. It's made that way. It was meant to do that. When you wind it up, or put the battery in or whatever it is, it's providing the motive power. It's internally doing that, but it does what it does. Things are what they are. Wheels turn because they're round. You don't need an external, influence really to do that. And all these views, again, whether it's internal or external, is assuming this sort of universe that's full of independent, unconnected individual objects. Okay, and that's what the causality is. It's among, either internally caused with these things, or it's externally, things are acting on each other, physically, directly, or with beams or whatever, indirect, energetic cause. Basically all the same thing. So what's interesting about this is that we can look at alternative models. And so it's not to say that these models are wrong, it's just, let's think about the fact that maybe we could have an alternative modeling. So in the tradition, we can, for example, look at Plotinus, and he has Aeneid 2, Treatise 3, are the stars causes, was the question. And he says no. He says that astrology, divination works. You can predict, but he said it's not because the stars are directly doing the cause of things. They're not beaming energy at you or whatever. He says the stars are like characters written on the heavens, and they do their whatever, the tasks they do, they're orbiting or doing whatever they are, but they incidentally have this ability through their patterning for us to be able to see the meaning, in the cycles on the earth. The heavenly cycles reflect these underlying spiritual cycles, which are also reflected in the earthly events. So he says, for example, you can come to a conclusion about someone's character and by looking at their eyes or other parts of the body. I mean, one part reflects the other. So that's because the cosmos is one great unified being. He says all things are full of signs, and the wise man can learn about one thing from the other. So everything's joined together, everything's part of the all, and therefore that is the basis for astrological or other types of divination. And that's also a very interesting idea in terms of the causality, because instead of thinking about the interactions of these separate objects, the fact that we actually give primacy to the unity and the connection of all things. So that's an interesting model. Another model to think about is comes from Buddhism. And, for example, and this was, I believe it was Tibetan Buddhism I was looking at, they said, well, obviously there's an objective reality because, everyone sees a pen. And it's like, here, does it hold up a pen? Everybody can see it's a pen. He says, well, it's not really true. It's because everyone with a similar karma sees it that way. I mean, if you're a human being, if you're in the society, you're like, okay, a pen is for writing with ink. I mean, but you could be, like I said, someone who comes from a different culture, they don't use pens, and you're like, okay, it's a black cylinder, right? So you not having the same karma. Another classic example from Buddhism is they say, well, you talk about a river, and so these different classes of beings see it differently. Said, humans see it as a river. You can swim in it. You can fish in it. The fish see it as a palace. If you're a being from the hell realms, you see it as fire because everything for you is fire. If you're from the God realm, from the devas, you see it as a flowing soma or whatever. It's very positive for you. So depending on what you're, and we can see this more in a conventional way, just in your perspective and what you're like I said, what you've learned and what you've taught, you can have different approaches. If I see an American flag as an American, I'm going to have a different reaction to that than someone from another country seeing an American flag. My conditioning, my influences, my history. So these different perspectives. So that similar karma, again, we're going to have a much different view of reality, much different view of things from similar karma. Another Buddhist idea is that of codependent arising. And so in this, again, you really can't, they do a certain amount of individual causes, but ultimately you can't really isolate single causes. The entire structure arises together. And Thich Nhat Hanh says, he says, everything arises in dependence on multiple causes and conditions, and nothing exists as a singular independent entity, right? So you really can't say, because everything doesn't exist, and then when the proper causes come together, it exists, and then when the proper causes come, it ceases to exist. So again, really there's no separate entity there. Ultimately, it's just it's sort of a convenient term to label something for the time being while it's here and doing its thing. So all of these models that talk about unity, though, there's, I think, some resistance to that. I mean, there's a lot of resistance to stepping outside of atheistic materialism. There's also a lot of resistance to this idea of that things are not separate. The unified models are much less attractive, I think. We spent 300 years trying to be separate, self-conscious individual, and we really don't want to give that up any more than we want to give up atheistic materialism. I mean, the sense that I get is it's like people just don't want to go there. As exciting and interesting as magic is, if we have to give up atheistic materialism, then that's too much of a price. So that's how you end up with the compartmentalization. Okay, I still think that there's nothing but matter and energy unconsciously, but I'm going to do magic, I'm going to do astrology. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you can compartmentalize and do it. So what really struck me, though, and maybe one of the major points, I've got two key points for this video, was this final model of causality that I'm going to talk about. And this is basically dream causality. So if you think about it, you're having a dream, and so, for example, you're standing at the top of a hill, and a rock rolls all the way down the hill, and it smashes up a bottle. It's like, okay, so what's the causality there? That there's really a rock and there really was a bottle being smashed and the rock caused the bottle to smash? That's not the causality. The causality there is that there's a single dreamer having the dream, right? And these aren't really even real objects. They're just part of the dream. And the unity and the causality there ultimately is provided by that unity of consciousness and the fact that there's a dreamer. And the other weird thing about it, as I would say, is that what we take to be the I in the dream is simply another dream character. That the true consciousness, unless you're highly aware and an enlightened being, that's not really manifesting. That there's this manifestation of these individual dream characters. So that's very trippy to me. It's like think of that causality as like there really isn't some independent being, and there really isn't the causality. It's the unity of consciousness that provides the causality. And so, that's interesting as a mind game. The deeper thing to do with that is to actually touch that and actually have, like I said, if you're sort of tripping out on that, if it's kind of making you a little high, or it's sort of like you're having, it's like a sense of like that's true, that's a more useful way of looking at it. If it's just a mind game, if you're just playing with it, then that's not that useful. So I think that dream causality was like that. If I had to say what really my sense of causality is, that's what I find myself, at this perspective that I'm at, drawn to. Now, a very important thing I think to say is that after some of the deeper structure video, I had a couple people email and say, "You're right. The battery's wrong and the rays are wrong and what you say is right. I agree with you." This is not the point of the video. The point of the video is not to start positing that this is a correct reality and everyone else's reality is wrong and argue about that. What's happening in this is I'm saying, look, these are models, okay? The dream model or the karma model or the Aeneid, Plotinus's Aeneid model or beams and rays, these are simply different models, different perspectives. They are useful or more or less useful depending on the perspective and the situation that you're in. They are more or less accurate. None of them is completely accurate. None of them is completely false. Ultimately, what you need to do is to work with them, to see which resonates for you, to see what's useful for you in the various circumstances. But there is not one right model, and there was not one right answer or right reality that everyone else, should be bludgeoned into accepting. So those are, like I said, those are I'd say the key points that I would take away from this is that tripping on that dream causality as not even really being, not only are they not even separate objects, but the real unity is from the unity of consciousness. And then the recognition that these are all models and that there's not one right reality, that's hard for people to give up, and I have to work on it myself. So I hope you find that interesting. I think that these are pointing to some very deep questions and giving us some insight that's very practical for as we're thinking about astrology and magic. Just the idea of being conscious of the worldview and modeling and causality that you're using is very useful. And then also it has a deeper spiritual possibility in terms of following this stuff down the rabbit hole. So I hope that's interesting, and look forward to delving into more of these with videos in both my podcast with Andy Kessler, the Deep Astrology, and also doing more independent videos on my own.